Hello and welcome to Spotlight on Art Academics. My name is Alamade and I am a liberal arts finalist. And today we're going to be meeting members of our faculty and getting to know them a bit better. So hello everyone. How are we doing?
Yeah, doing great.
Good.
Thanks for having us.
So it would be great if we could go around and, say your name, the modules that you teach, and your research interests. Brian, if we could start with you, that'd be great.
Sure. So hi, everyone. I'm Brian Brazo. I'm a senior teaching fellow in the liberal arts department, and I teach a range of modules, including the first year core module on science, society, and the media. I also teach a wide range of optional modules, including Underworlds, Paradises, Quest 1, Departure and Enchantment, Quest 2, Exile and Homecoming, and a Sustainable Serenissima, which focuses on Venice and sustainability.
Amazing. Kirsten?
My name's Kirsten Harris, and I teach the first year module on qualitative research methods, and then I teach the second year core module on consumption and an optional module on utopias. And I also head up a lot of the equalities work in the department.
Hi, folks. I'm Gavin Schwartzleeper. I teach on the first year core module, Art and Revolution. I also oversee the dissertation module for the finalists, and I teach an optional module on the apocalyptic imaginary.
Amazing. Thank you all for being here. Gavin, maybe we can start off with you. My question is, can you tell us a little bit more about the BA Liberal Arts degree here at Warwick?
Yeah, for sure. So our degree program is really distinctive. It's not like other degree programs in the UK, and that includes other liberal arts degrees, right? So of course, there's a difference between liberal arts programs and traditional degree programs here in the UK. The key distinction is that liberal arts programs tend to be structured around allowing students to design their own programs of learning. So they can pick modules or classes from across the institution and put them together into a framework that makes sense for them, right? United around a particular series of interests they got, something like that. Traditional programs tend to be very heavily focused on a particular discipline or area of study. So economics, classics, history, that kind of thing. And so where our program is really distinctive is that we found that a lot of liberal arts programs, especially here in the UK, are too flexible. They're too open. If you can set a student free in a university that has thousands of classes running at any one time, it's really overwhelming, really isolating. We found that students really need extra support, lots and lots of frameworks and support for how to relativize their learning, how to make sense of taking a classics module with a history module and an English module. That skill doesn't come naturally. That's something that has to be cultivated and built and supported. So when we set up our program, we built it around problem-based learning. So this gives teaching and learning methodology means that instead of focusing on trying to say you do a little bit of everything, and therefore you're not really good at any one thing in particular, we teach students how to look for problems that cut across lots of different kinds of disciplines. So climate change is one of the classic examples. Food security is another. These are really wicked, complex problems that can't be resolved neatly by one person. And they allow students to focus on not only the problems that matter most to them, but they can approach that in the ways that matter most to them, that feel most effective to them. So our students learn to be really critical about selecting not just modules from different parts of the university that help them address the problems they're interested in, but also how to approach those problems using different kinds of research methodologies, different kinds of theoretical approaches, lots of different kinds of case studies. We really help students to feel empowered to tackle the problems that matter most to them, whether those are really practical professional problems from the world of work, or they're more academic problems in their particular area of interest.
Wow, thank you so much. You actually basically answered my next question as well, which was going to be what makes our program different to other ones. But since you've kind of covered that, maybe we could talk a bit about pathways. Maybe you could explain how that you kind of go about deciding what pathway you're going to take.
Sure. Most liberal arts students don't arrive knowing 100% that, exactly what they're going to do. Right. In fact, when we were setting up the degree, we did a ton of research with prospective students right across the UK and found that actually most students don't really know what they want to do. They feel like they've been told, oh, you're really good at math, so maybe you should do economics, that'll lead to a good career, or, that you were always bookish and you loved reading, so of course you should do English literature and maybe you'll be a teacher or something. These kinds of responses are super common. And so what we wanted to do was to strike a bit of a balance. We want to give enough structure that students feel supported and can pursue their area of interest and see what they're interested in, but also enough flexibility that they can change their minds. So the pathway structure that you're talking about, over the course of the first year, our Director of Student Experience works really closely with students to help them try to work out what options they might take, what areas they might be interested in, how they could start to use Warwick's, world-leading teaching and research to help support their particular interests and work out what that might be. At the end of the first year, students declare what we call a pathway. This is a specialization, and it broadly falls into two different kinds of pathway. Some students are really interested in a particular subject, a traditional discipline. Maybe this is English or classics or languages, for example. But they want to approach it from a slightly different direction from traditional students. This is really common for a lot of our students. They intentionally don't choose to do an economics degree in a traditional department. They want to come study economics through a problem-based lens with us. So that's one option. The other option is what we call a specialist interest. And this is an opportunity for students to really, really develop their own unique specialization. So we have students who have picked things from, health and human society. There's a lot of stuff around culture and media that students get really interested in. I know obviously you are, Olamide, interested in these kinds of questions. We have students who are interested in things like childhood development. So, again, there's opportunities for students to draw modules and approaches from right across the university around a specific area of interest. So when they graduate, again, they're not students who have done a little bit of everything and therefore aren't good at any one thing. They're students who have really, really unusual in-depth knowledge about a particular area. It's just that they can draw from lots of different disciplines to support that particular area of interest.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for that answer, Gavin. And I think I'm going to open up the next question to the floor. It is, can you tell us about some of the problems your research connects to? Maybe if we start with Kirsten?
Yeah, sure. So I've got two main areas of research, and one is to do with the American poet Walt Whitman, but then more generally looking out from him at how poetry connects to kind of political movements and agitation. So for me, the broader question that I'm interested in, or the problem, if you like, is what can art and culture how can art and culture speak to matters of political and social agitation and rebellion, basically. So I'm interested not just in how art and culture reflects particular moments or particular movements, but also how it might shape it, how it might have an influence on the way that political thought or social activism might develop. That's one area, and it's connected to the second area, which is utopias. So I do a lot of research in utopias and utopianism, which is basically just how might we think and imagine a better society? And this is a really kind of clear social problem, I think, and it's really appropriate to the kind of study that we do in liberal arts, because you can think about it from the perspective of a cultural subject like English literature. So you could look at how people have written in fiction different kind of utopias and imagine different societies. But if you're interested in economics or labor or wealth distribution or any of these kind of things, you can also bring your knowledge from those subjects and apply it to this problem of how might we imagine and bring about a better society.
Amazing. And I took the Utopias module in second year, so I would recommend it. Brian.
Yeah, so my research background is in Italian literature and philosophy, and initially I was really interested, and still am, in how we construct heroes. So how we construct ideas of heroes, how those heroic narratives link up, in a sense, with society, but also with other movements, and how they kind of can move forward certain ways of construction of the self. That leads into sort of the bigger questions that I look at, which are often questions around poetics, which really look at this question of not just how we tell stories, but how we actually construct knowledge. So it's a poetics as a form of philosophy, if that makes sense, or seeing literature as something that exists between poetics and philosophy. So while Kirsten was just mentioning her research looks at sort of art and culture in society and history more broadly, mine looks at kind of art and culture and poetry with a relationship to the self, with a relationship to how we know things, and looks at poetry as a form of knowledge in and of itself. And that includes, work that I've done on Dante and Latin Averroism in the 13th century and 14th century. It also includes work that I've done more recently looking at the Italian poet Torquato Tasso and how his work really claims that the lyric is the only way in which we can understand the world. So I guess the problems that my research really looks at, if we try to link them up to present day, are what role can poetry have as a form of knowledge in itself? So not just as something that's subservient, or culture and art being something that we look at, on the side, but something that in and of itself is a form of knowledge based on the way it's constructed and thought about.
Amazing. And how do you tend to bring your research interest into your teaching?
Okay, so many different ways. I think my interest in research, I should also mention, I'm very interested in classical reception as well. So the reception of texts from the classical world in other cultures, and sort of later on in time. And part of that links to work that I've done on the reception of Aristotle in the Renaissance. So in a sense, that's led me to think about how we construct scientific knowledge today. And again, the fact that scientific knowledge is not this pure certainty that we have. It's something that is socially constructed, like all forms of knowledge. So that really links to my teaching of the core module on science, society, and the media, where we look at things like the science wars in the first term and this debate about what reality truly is between the humanities and the sort of the sciences, physics, and things like that. In terms of the optional modules that I teach, I bring my research interests in different ways. So examples of this are, for example, in Underworlds, we look at the construction of underworlds, the construction of space, and that module sort of orbits around Dante's Inferno, but of course looks at it from this really interesting transdisciplinary perspective. So there I bring in, my knowledge of Dante, but also thinking about, Dante's idea of poetry as this sort of form of knowledge, as this form of poetry, as a form of philosophy, if you will. And then in my Paradise module and Paradise Spaces, we look not just at paradise spaces, false paradises in the epics of Tasso and Ariosto, but we also look at how those epics, in a sense, affected the colonial imagination, looking particularly at how Columbus, for example, constructs his idea of a colonial geography based on his reading of Dante's Purgatory. So this is, again, how literature is not just this side thing, but is seen as a form of knowledge in and of itself. And then in my 2 quest modules, so for example, in Quest 1, we look specifically at the construction of heroes. We look at the problematic model of Campbell's hero's journey. We deconstruct that, we unpack it, we ask what it means for us today. We look at how that relates to things like entrepreneurship. And then in Quest 2, for example, I look at, how we kind of construct these ideas of home and exile, along with the idea of modernity as a form of exile and the sort of problematic nature of that. And one way that I bring my research interests in there is I'm very interested in sort of early 20th century Italian surrealism. So we talk a little bit about that and how that movement sort of received the idea of the Italian Renaissance, shaped it, reframed it, but then how problematic that was in the early 20th century.
Wow. That sounds so interesting. Thank you so much. And again, yeah, I took SSM in first year, and it's definitely a module that has stuck with me throughout my degree and probably throughout my life. So thank you for that. And last but not least, Gavin, can you tell us a bit about your research, please, and the problems it connects to?
Sure. So my research really works in 2 different areas. Originally, I still am, an English Renaissance literature, history, and religion researcher. And I'm really interested in ideas about how, quite similar, especially to Brian in this respect, I'm interested in how we construct the past, how we construct and make use of these sort of ideas and narratives about the past, how all of those sorts of things function. So one, it's about, the process of writing history, but also the process of receiving history and how it influences society. And so that, that connects really neatly with Art and Revolution, which I teach for all of the first years. It's not about having students do a kind of history class where you learn names and dates, which is, in my mind, not really what history is about anyway. It's about helping people to understand, especially for the liberal arts program, how do we access the past? How do we understand and contextualize these particular, things like letters or pamphlets or speeches or songs or, all these different kinds of objects, so that we can really make effective use of them, so that we can understand the ways in which the past can be written in lots of different sorts of ways. And whether that means, we try to approach things from the perspective of historically excluded groups, that's certainly one part of it, but also trying to help people understand, that our students in particular understand that, historical events are never neat and tidy. There's, if you get two eyewitnesses to an event, you'll have two different kinds of stories about it. So helping people just to understand that kind of complexity. The second element is really around education itself. I'm really interested in, I suppose, a whole series of radical pedagogies, of radical ways of teaching and learning, that try to help students to be more egalitarian, so that, instead of a member of staff, a lecturer standing at the front of the room, just saying, I know everything and you don't know anything and you've paid to be here, so I'm going to tell you everything I know so that you feel like you got good value for money. Instead, it's about recognizing that education really is about conversation. It's about dialogue. It's about group-based discussions. So, for example, I do work on anarchist pedagogies. I do work on co-creation as a particular kind of pedagogic concept. But it's all based around, again, this liberal arts idea about, how do individuals learn by themselves? How do they learn collectively? How can they learn to work together in more effective sorts of ways, rather than seeing everybody else's competition?
Thank you so much. I think you really drew on the fact that, liberal arts is about taking control of your own learning. And it's about, engaging with objects and deciphering them for yourself rather than just being told what things are supposed to mean. So in talking about that, Kirsten, what sort of opportunities are there to undertake original primary research in the liberal arts department?
Well, I'm really glad that you asked that, because this is something that we are super passionate about here in liberal arts, and it's a real strength of our course, I think, in that all students in all degrees across the country will do the kind of secondary research that students with us also do, which is going to the library and learning what other academics have said about the topics or the problems that you're looking into. And our students obviously do that too. But what we like to do as well is to train them in different forms of primary research, some of which students often only usually do in master's level courses or PhDs. We like to get them started on it right from year one, so that they can bring something kind of additional to their studies, so that they've got a whole toolkit of research skills. I wanted to start by saying that if everything that we've been saying so far sounds a bit artsy cultural to some students, that's because that's what our particular interests are. But we do have other members of staff that are really interested in the more quantitative sides of things, and who work with numbers, data, statistics, all that kind of thing as well. So there are two modules that students do in their first year that gives them the basic training in doing their own primary research. So in the first year, students can take a module in quantitative research, where they learn how to use data sets, how to access data sets, the kind of data sets that might help you answer real world problems, say to do with healthcare and public health and things like that. And then I teach a module on qualitative research. And this just means the kind of research that doesn't deal with numbers, but instead asks questions like why, who, for what reason, these kinds of questions. So we give students the skills in that module to do the kind of research like going to an archive, accessing historical sources physically, holding them in your hands. We give them the tools to know how you conduct an interview. How do you design an interview? How do you get ethical approval for it? How do you conduct a survey? How do you ask the right questions? How do you know what kind of answers to kind of give us options, that kind of thing? But also how you look at cultural texts, how you might say analyze a poem or a pop music video from any kind of time period. So we give the students these skills in the first year. And then in our modules, we build in the opportunity for students to be able to use their own initiative and to use those skills. So for example, in the second year module I teach on consumption, there's a research project at the end. Now students can approach that project in whatever way they want. So if they want to write a traditional research essay that uses the library, they can do that. But if they want to do archival research, they can do that. If they want to do interviews, they can do that. And so every year, students kind of take the opportunity to do something a little bit more imaginative. And this is kind of replicated in, all of our modules as well. It's not just consumption. Students can all the time think, I know they're asking me to do this right now, and I'm going to do something a little bit different, and I'm going to go and find some, say, original primary sources in a library, or a data set that I know exists out there, and I'm going to do some original kind of analytical work with that.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that answer. Okay, coming up next, we have a big question, the one that's on every prospective student's mind. What is problem-based learning? Who wants to have a crack at that one?
Okay, well, Gavin already explained it a little bit at the beginning. So just to recap on what Gavin said, liberal arts for us here at Warwick means that, as well as taking your optional modules throughout the university, or with us if you like, we do some transdisciplinary modules, which means that within those modules, we bring in learning and knowledge from lots of different kinds of disciplines and subjects, and we base them around problem-based learning. Now, problem-based learning is simply we identify together as a class. Sometimes we set them for you, sometimes you find them yourselves as students, particular problems, and then we set about answering them, drawing on all this different kinds of knowledge from different kinds of disciplines. So I think Gavin mentioned earlier, sometimes these problems are very focused on contemporary real world issues. So in the year 2 core module on sustainability, for example, that whole module is organized around each week you address a different kind of problem that you can see playing out in our real world. So it might be a problem to do with educational inequality. It might be a problem to do with food deserts, for example. You know, there's tons of different kind of sustainability oriented real world problems. On the other hand, the problems might be more academic and philosophical in nature. So if you're someone who's more interested in history or kind of theoretical ideas, you know, you don't have to just study those real world contemporary problems. And so an example of that is in my year 2 module on consumption, again, a core module. We look at more kind of conceptual, philosophical problems to do with the idea of consumption. So it might be to do with consumption and lifestyle, or how different ideas about gender are commodified and consumed. Or so again, every week we answer a problem. Now, the way that it plays out in different modules changes. So we've all got our own different way of doing problem-based learning. But what I like to do is every week I give students a problem. Students are then given pointers about how to go away and do their own research on that problem. Sometimes it's quite set. I give them set text. Sometimes they've got a bit more freedom to do their own research as to what interests them. And then they come back, they work together in groups. The students will pool their knowledge. So they're working together collectively. The whole principle is that kind of the sum is greater than the parts. So you will teach each other what you've learned about that particular problem, and then you produce a response to it or an intervention in the problem. So you get the benefit of the teacher's knowledge, but more than that, you get the benefit of your own independent research, your classmates' independent research, and then you form an analytical response to the problem.
And I might add to that, one of the really great things about problem-based learning, one of the things I personally love about it, is because it's so student-centered, because it's really centered on students exploring these problems for themselves, navigating them in their own ways, in ways that are meaningful to them. Our classes are never the same 2 years in a row. So you can teach the same class year after year, and every time you will have a different discussion because the students themselves will be different. And this really makes the knowledge construction in the class really feel like it's a team effort. It's really co-created. It's not just simply the instructor giving you, knowledge that you have to memorize, but it's you creating that knowledge for yourself. And that's one of the really important things in PBL, which psychologists have pointed to and call the IKEA effect, where you really value things that you build yourself so much more than things that are ready-made and given to you. And I really think that's true in the classroom as well.
And can I add one more thing to that? Sorry, you've got us started on one of our favourite topics. Because liberal arts students all have different specialisms, like Gavin was talking about with the pathways, we might have some students with an economic specialism, some with a sustainability, some with history or philosophy. And so when you bring together those different sets of expertise, really something kind of special can happen when you're looking at a problem, because each student has a different kind of set of expertise.
Okay, great. I think I heard the word co-creating in there somewhere. I was wondering maybe someone could kind of explain to a prospective student what that means and how that might look in the classroom.
Yeah, I'd be happy to tackle that one. So co-creation it can be interpreted in lots of different sorts of ways, but at its most basic level, it sort of is what it sounds like. You know, when we come together in the classroom, you know, traditional methodologies for teaching and learning, especially in universities, will be around the sage on the stage. You know, you'll have the professor standing at the front of the room lecturing and saying, you know, here's what I know about a particular topic, and the students are meant to kind of take notes, discuss, think it, you know, turn it over in their mind, and then produce, you know, exams or essays or something like that that indicate that they've heard and understood what the lecturer is saying. But that's not the way that academic research really gets done, or extremely, extremely rarely. You know, very often, much more commonly, you know, academics work in dialogue with each other. We're constantly talking to each other, debating, discussing, you know, arriving at consensuses or rejecting prior consensuses, you know, as a way of establishing what we believe to be true, right? And so, of course, you know, Brian's talking about like the construction of the idea of truth itself as well, not just, you know, individual bits and pieces of knowledge. Um, but when we talk about co-creation in our classrooms, we're really talking about, again, helping students to recognize that they themselves can bring original knowledge, valuable knowledge to these kinds of conversations. So to give an example of how this works, Kirsten has already talked a little bit about this, but as a specific example, in Art and Revolution, students spend all of their time in the classroom and discussing little you know, articles or theories or primary objects that they found with each other. So they're doing that kind of peer-to-peer learning, you know, explaining things to each other. And again, if anybody watching this has done any kind of tutoring, for example, you know that you might think you know something, but if you have to explain it to somebody else, that's when you really start to learn about that topic. So the students are constantly, you know, sort of discussing and explaining concepts to each other. And then they have to go and create a presentation. They have to create a kind of a response to whatever problem we're dealing with, or a particular issue, a particular theme. And so what is happening in that kind of classroom space is that, again, rather than a teacher saying, here is what you need to know, here is what's correct or not correct, students are testing what might or might not be correct. So they're constantly listening to each other when other students are speaking and saying, I disagree with what that person's saying. When they're reading Hannah Arendt, for example, they might be thinking, you know, she's talking about violence. This is a complicated topic. This student says one thing about it, but that doesn't fit with my reading. Who is right? And so the cognitive processes that are going on there allow for a much richer, much deeper engagement with the concept, rather than me standing at the front of the room saying, here's what Hannah Arendt meant about violence.
Thank you so much for that informative answer. This is kind of an open question, actually. So given current events, I was wondering how that has had an effect on teaching. Brian, perhaps if you want to start on this one.
Yeah, certainly. So in Science, Society, and the Media, we look at the really complicated, really wicked problem of how is scientific knowledge constructed, how is our impression of science constructed, but then how does that play out within society, how has that played out in society, and how does it continue to play out in our media constructions of science today, both in sort of what we would consider fiction and nonfiction, though again, I would trouble that boundary, but that's just my own thing. So what we did this year in Science, Society, and the Media was, because COVID was so central in the media and our media constructions and discourses around it were so important and such a contemporary problem, we spent about 5 or 6 weeks in term 2 analyzing how the media constructs these narratives around COVID. So we used this to talk about resistance to science. We used it to talk about, you know, different ways that media power structures are established. We used it to talk about whether or not we think journalists should have a certain code of ethics when reporting on these things. One of the activities that the students did was to create a set of guidelines for BBC News reporters when reporting on COVID, based on some theoretical readings we'd done around the media. And it was really interesting to see the different ways that we approached this this, the different ideas that came out, the sort of complexity of really navigating this incredibly contemporary problem where we're hoping to get the latest science every day, but where people's impressions of science are running up against the actual slow pace of science, which relies on peer review and consensus, and the incredible danger that happened with COVID, where we began to rely on preprints, which are, scientific studies that have not been vetted by the community. And this is fundamentally changing the way scientific knowledge has been constructed since the 17th century. And it's going to be a revolution in science. So it was really interesting in class to see that and to talk about it as it played out sort of from day to day.
Amazing. Was there anyone else that wanted to add anything to that?
Well, just adding on from that, again, thinking about COVID-19 in the Utopias module that I teach, all of a sudden, this ideas that we've been talking about in class for all the years I've taught this module, we're watching being played out on kind of in the real world. So the idea of a total rupture from the old way of life, everything kind of paused and stopped. And then this opened up a window or a space, if you like, for a lot of debates. I think you're hearing it a little bit less now, but certainly this time last year, you were hearing it a lot about how you build back better, right? This was the phrase that was being thrown around a lot. And so in class, we really addressed this issue like, well, okay, it's great that everyone's talking about building back better now, but what does that mean? What problems do we need to address? How does public health connect to emotional well-being, connect to relationships, all these kind of things? I think the other major example in Utopias was the horrific events surrounding George Floyd, and then the Black Lives Matter movement afterwards. Everything that was going on with the debate around statues and all of this kind of thing, that again really played into what students wanted to talk about this year in Utopias. And so we do have a lot of flexibility to change the curriculum depending on what is current and what is going on. So this year students really wanted to talk about that. They really wanted to look beyond the borders of England. They wanted to talk about how we might decolonize utopian studies. They wanted to talk about, never mind kind of thinking about African American expressions, they wanted to look at African expressions of utopia. And so we went with that. And so I think that the way that we teach, there is that flexibility to change a curriculum depending on what students are interested in and what's going on in the real world.
And to give a further example even of how quickly this can change, in my apocalyptic imaginary module, which is for second and final year students, I normally teach it in term 2, which means it starts kind of in the second week of January. And one of our first case studies that we've done for the past couple of years in that module is about a group of far-right American extremists that have, really contested, shall we say, the federal government's right to exercise control over federal land. And it was, obviously the events of January 6th were shocking in lots of different ways, but it was especially shocking for me in some ways to see the people that I've been studying and discussing, for years are now on the steps of the Capitol buildings trying to smash their way in. So in the course of just a few days, the whole perspective, mine, our students, our whole perspective on that case study was really radically overhauled. And it was a really sobering reminder that, the walls of the academy are actually very thin. The kind of stuff exactly like both Kirsten and Brian are talking about, the kind of work we do, again, even if it seems very abstract and academic at certain points, or certain students have that more of that kind of interest, there are always ways to connect it in whatever way that you feel is important. And again, sometimes those connections are pushed on you more firmly. And I think this year has really demonstrated that even more than others.
Yeah, I definitely think that the liberal arts department, I think the word that comes to mind is dynamic. I feel like a lot of the time in academia, it can be static, but there's always something new to learn, and you guys really just encourage students to bring what they're interested in to the classroom. And I think that's amazing about the department. So we're actually coming up towards the end of our session. So I think I'm going to end it on a really nice question. What inspires you the most about your teaching and research in the liberal arts department? Maybe if we could start with Brian?
I would say absolutely the students. It's not just a pleasure, it's an honor to teach such motivated, talented, interested students. And I love the experience of being in the classroom with these students because I'm able to bring in things to set up these activities, but then the discussions we have all walk away thinking, oh, that I'd never thought of that before in that way. Or just to see, a student be able to approach a contemporary event in a way that's really meaningful using tools that they've developed in the class. I mean, it's so valuable to me to see that. And it's one of the things that I love about teaching in this department is that you can really help students foster their own interests. It's not about, saying, oh, you have to love the things that I love, you have to be fascinated with the things that I'm fascinated with, but getting them to develop those critical tools to find something they really care about in the world, and then helping them develop ways to approach that, ways to think about that, and ways to really craft, I think, a meaningful sense of both self and of relationship of that self to a broader horizon of significance in the world.
Kirsten?
My answer is very boringly similar to Brian's, actually. It's very close. But what I would say is that as teachers, because students have this freedom to pursue their own academic interests in our classes, it means that marking assessments is never boring. So in previous kind of subjects that I've worked in, you'd answer, mark 20 assessments all the same. Whereas because students are identifying their own problems that connect to their own academic areas of interest, you can read 20 essays and they're all wildly different, which is, really inspiring for us as teachers. But also, yeah, just the fact that we talk a lot in kind of academic jargon about research-led teaching, right? So this is the idea that we go out and we do our research and then we use that to bring and teach in the classroom. And that's true, we definitely do that. But I feel that there's a lot of teaching-led research here as well. So we teach things in the classroom, and like Brian was saying, students bring ideas and knowledge that we'd never heard about, we didn't know about. It's not limited by our own particular knowledge, but then that helps us to go out and develop our research in new and exciting and interesting ways. So there's this kind of really nice kind of dynamic connection, I think, with student research and our research.
Yeah, so I think in some ways my favorite sort of aspect of the department is our departmental values. And before people start thinking that sounds really pious and obnoxious, that our values are the best. We're very conscious that in no way are we a perfect department. When it comes to supporting diverse, kinds of students, whether that be socioeconomic status, race and ethnicity, gender, geopolitical background, whatever it might be, of course, there's always more work to be done. As one of my favorite authors, Enrico Malatesta, the great early anarchist, said, and I'm paraphrasing, but not too much, we're all hypocrites, but our goal is to be as least hypocritical as we possibly can be, to constantly strive to get as close to our ideal values as we possibly can be. And that's something that our department really, really values. So it's something that, we all work on in different sorts of ways, but Kirsten has been fantastic in helping to really drive and shape how we approach questions. Like she mentioned, decolonizing the curriculum. This is something that's a real complex, important question. How do we get diverse, different kinds of voices into our reading lists? How do we even step beyond that to think about different kinds of classroom activities and what sort of students are privileged or disadvantaged by those kinds of activities? Academics around the world are united by the fact that they love the work that, the kind of thing they're interested in, they're really passionate about it, and they want to share that with people. But we have to recognize that just being interested in something, that's not enough. We also have to think really carefully about who the other people in the classroom are, who the people who aren't in the classroom, why that might be. And I think, our department really does put a lot of energy into thinking about those sorts of questions. Like I said, we'll never get it perfectly right all the time. That's okay. But we're always really striving toward that perfection.
And can I just add to that if people are interested in finding out more about it, we've got a page on our websites about our commitment to fair and accessible education, which really kind of shows that it's more than just a statement of values. It kind of explains exactly how that's enacted in our practices.
Adding on to that, actually, if people wanted to find out more about the Liberal Arts Department here at Warwick, where can they go?
So probably the best place is, of course, our website, which is warwick.ac.uk/liberal arts. But we're also on the various social media platforms, so you can check us out, whichever is your favorite. we also have, well, as you know very well, Olamide, we have a number of blogs and things hosted through the central Warwick student blogger facilities. Olamide was an excellent blogger with us for a number of years. So there's lots of different routes for students to find out more. But really what I would say is, often when we present this information, and like we've been talking about today, liberal arts means a lot of different things, but we really care about what it means to you. So if you listening to this are thinking, okay, this sounds kind of interesting, but I'm not sure what modules I could take or how this program could support my individual interest, just get in touch with us. We would love to have a one-on-one chat with you. You're very welcome to sit in on classes, whatever you need to do. We would love to show you what this program might mean for you specifically. And then we can also get a sense of how you might contribute to the further enrichment of the program itself as well.
Equally, if you're already a Warwick student and you're interested in learning more about the department, you're interested in trying out some of our modules, look around on our webpage. We have a lot of really interesting optional modules, and we really welcome students from other departments to come and take them. An example of this is in the Venice module I just finished teaching intensively. We had a student from engineering who brought a completely different perspective when we were discussing, the Mose Dam project, and we really foster that kind of cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary conversation in the classroom. So if any of this has sort of jumped out at you, you're interested, you're a current Warwick student in another program, have a look at our website and come try out one of our modules or send us an email.
Well, that's it. Thank you so much for joining me today.